Welcome to week 4 of ethics. We are going to talk about virtue theory this week. I'm going to open up a few windows. You should probably do the same if you want to have them on your computer to look at. There's also an outline in the file section of Canvas called Virtue Theory Outline or Outline for Virtue Theory. So if you print that or have it on a screen, you can follow along as you watch this. So I'm going to, as I said, go right over. So we're going to start with some of the course goals today, which include questions to ask when doing the reading. I'm going to reference the readings that are hyperlinked here. I'm going to do them here in the lecture in reverse order that you probably should do them at home, which is to say, at home you might want to try the Changing Our Minds article first. That's in Commonweal magazine, which is a Catholic policy, culture, arts magazine. And Kristen Newlieb has this very nice short introduction to virtue theory. I would start reading that and then read books 1 and 2 of Aristotle. These are some old translations. I'll get to those in a minute. Maybe you should do all of that before watching this, just to get a feel for what the readings say, and then we'll go through them. I will reference books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics as we go along. The Newlieb, which I'll get to towards the end. And I already subscribed, so. And I think that's all I need to say. So let's start with virtue theory, and I'm going to do the overview. So we've already talked about Mill's greatest happiness principle, or consequentialism, the idea that ethics is captured, or morality is captured best by maximizing the net balance of pleasures over pains for sentient creatures. That's one approach. That is not today's approach. We also talked about Kant's categorical imperative, which attempts, and I'm sort of paraphrasing from your screen here on overview, to generate consistent rules we could universalize for all rational people, so we don't treat others as mere objects. That's one moral approach. That is not today's moral approach. Instead, virtue theory asks, what kind of people should we be to lead a good or moral life? Perhaps the best way to get into this is to imagine if you had to teach a small child to do the right thing, to be a good person. What would you do? My guess is you wouldn't try a simplified version of Kant or Mill. My guess is you want to say, well, you want to be a good person because that's the goal, right? You want to do the right thing for its own sake. You want to be a good person because you want to have a good character or a good identity or a good self. If you approached morality with a small child that way, you probably didn't even know it, but you were asking virtue theory kind of questions. So by the end of the week, I hope you can answer these questions. How would virtue theory handle everyday situations? There's the grandma and fruitcake example. I'm hoping that you wouldn't say if it was an awful fruitcake that grandma made you for Christmas or whatever, it tastes like, there's the word. And then my guess is you wouldn't just lie straight up as best you can. Oh, this is the best fruitcake ever. If you were somewhere in the middle, or that intermediate state between too much truth and too little, my guess is you're also being Aristotelian, because that's what he calls the virtuous answer. Let's see. There are your readings. So here are some questions to consider, and you can look at these before you read for Aristotle. What he means by happiness is decidedly not Mill's answer, perhaps not even Kant's answer. And we'll get to the Aristotle's definition of happiness in a minute. What he means by pursuing the good life for its own sake is what philosophers would call the intrinsic pleasure of something. Also is not Mill's answer. He does say, Aristotle, that we have certain functions to achieve, certain functions that are sort of natural or normal for human beings. The famous definition you may have heard is that humans, Aristotle would have said man, but humans are rational animals. And when we follow our natural function, he says we achieve a kind of excellence or sort of good performance. It's not a theater performance, it's a human performance. He does have examples of virtue, and we'll talk about those. And then he will claim, and Newlieb in her short piece in the Commonweal magazine says something similar, he will claim the best or moral life is achieved by hitting this intermediate state between excess and deficiency, which are both by him considered vices or bad ways to live. So that's sort of where we're headed. I'm going to go to the outline here, which again is in the file section of Canvas. Let's try to make a list, and you might do this at home with a different list, of what virtues you think are valuable and that we can have too little of, that would be a deficiency, or too much of. So what virtues, I'm an A2 in your outline, what virtues do you think make a good life, right? Make you a good person? I mentioned before that I was raised Catholic, and the Catholic tradition has draws on Aquinas, who a medieval philosopher who famously drew on Aristotle. So this vocabulary may seem familiar to anyone raised in a religious family, but even if you haven't been, virtue language is part of our culture, part of the Western European tradition, part of ancient Greece. So I have a list here if we were to brainstorm. I imagine you might say, well, a virtuous or good person should be honest, courageous, generous, patient. There's that phrase, patience is a virtue, compassionate. And I guess the central question before we read any Aristotle here is, can you have too little or too much of this? So let's talk about honesty, because we just did the fruitcake example. Grandma gives you a nasty fruitcake for your birthday, for Christmas. You want to be honest. You don't want to say it's nasty. That might be the excess. Oh, this is disgusting. It's gross, and so on. On the other hand, that's too much honesty. Is there such a thing as too little? I mean, you don't want to go overboard, but I guess, pardon the expression, you don't want to be underboard either. So you don't want to, say, oh, it's the best thing I've ever looked forward to, or wow, I've never had anything quite like this. And of course, that's not being honest either. What you need is sort of some midpoint, which isn't too much honesty or too little. Aristotle will say, and we'll see this as we do the reading, the virtues are acting at the right time, in the right place, in the right way. So there's going to be some variability here by situation. Same thing might go for, let's pick another one that we could have, courage. Typically, somebody might say courage is facing your fear in dangerous situations. I always think of soldiers or firefighters, who go to great risks to save lives. Maybe that kind of courage isn't expected of each of us every single day, but there is courage in having to sort of make difficult decisions that maybe you don't want to make. Is there such a being as being too courageous? To use the firefighter example, do we expect the everyday civilian or citizen to rush into a fire and save people? Well, maybe that's too much. But then there's, too little, not even thinking about it, not even pausing to call 911 if you see a fire, right? That's a tiny, tiny risk. So it seems like there might be a right amount of courage, right amount of honesty, patience, compassion. I'm trying to think of times where people are too patient, right? And we even have words for this, right? If if my best friend is constantly not showing up for me, and I make an appointment to have coffee with him, and he blows me off over and over and over, and I say, oh, I'll just wait, he'll come around. I mean, that's probably being a doormat. I'm too patient. If I'm not patient enough, he's 2 minutes late. Oh my gosh, come on. Where is he? Well, it's Austin. There's traffic or, whatever. So if you made any list like this, and Aristotle thinks in some cases in ancient Greek, there are words for the excess of too much and the deficiency of too little. If you may, and we may have those words in English, right? There's impatience, but probably different kinds. For honesty, there's too little as well, being dishonest or liar. Too much, oversharing. I'm sure there are words in English, if we were to look, for the too much and too little. But in Aristotle's view, and in virtue theorists like Aquinas and New Lieb for today's reading, the focus here is, and it's going to be difficult to talk about because it takes some work, like anything, is, and this is A3 in your handout, the kind of person you are when you live the life that the virtues suggest. And you might want to ask, as we're doing the lecture today and as you do the readings, are people who are courageous and honest and generous and patient and compassionate, are they better people? The answer shouldn't be just, well, we get better outcomes, because then that sounds utilitarian. I'm not denying that living in a society where people are honest and courageous and generous and patient and compassionate, I'm not denying that that's a great place to live. Right? A society that lacked people with those virtues would be miserable, right? But that can't be the only defense of the virtues, is that they give you better outcomes, because that would make it Mill's theory. And it can't just be the case that a virtuous person sits down and says, can I make the reason I'm acting universal for other people? To say it as sort of a point that Mill might make against himself, that Kantian framework seems overly mechanistic. It seems like something a mathematician turned philosopher would do. And what we're going to be asking today is, what is the happier kind of life that the virtuous person lives? What is the happiness he or she gains? And so I'm going to dig right into the Aristotle here, so I've already opened up the door. B1 in my outline. Happiness is our goal. Aristotle doesn't deny that. But he says, what are the right kinds of happiness? And this is book 1, section 6. I should say you can get any translation you want of Aristotle, right? All this stuff is in the public domain. Lots and lots of people translate it. I use this one because it's free. And the Internet Encyclopedia, is it? Let me go see the particular reading. Internet Classics. Okay. So darn it, where is it? Book 1. The translation may be a little clunky. I think this was translated in the mid-20th century. But what you get here is, in the first couple sections, Aristotle asking, well, what kind of happiness should we be seeking out, right, if that's a proper goal? And he says here, and I've just gone down to section 4 so you can see it. Well, if we're talking about the good life, the moral life, right, all sorts of things make people happy. Some people think, here we go, the obvious thing is pleasure. That might be Mill's answer. Or some people think maybe it's wealth, right? Or honor, or being esteemed highly by your colleagues and so on. Now he goes on to say here, well, when you're ill, health seems like the most important thing. And when you're poor, wealth seems like the most important thing. But what he's really after here in these first 6 sections is what kind of happiness is good in and of itself. And I don't think anybody listening to this lecture, certainly I don't, would think, well, honor is the most important happiness, right? Being esteemed as, courageous in the eyes of your fellow citizens. Or accumulating money is the most important thing. Or getting physical or mental pleasure is the most important thing. What Plato are going to be arguing here, Aristotle, who is Plato's most famous student, what Aristotle is going to be arguing here is, look, intrinsically, they're not the best thing to have. What we're after is the pleasure that is the best thing to have in and of itself. Let me go back to my outline. And you can read through sections 1 to 6 to see why he rejects the other kinds. It's in book 1, section 7. I'm in B2 in your outline. We need to ask is, well, if we want to know what the happiness is that's proper for human beings, and again, when you see man, you should think men or women, what's the right kind of happiness? Well, to know the answer to that, we need to know what is the function or purpose of human beings, right? If you knew what your function was, what your natural purpose was, this doesn't have to be religious, then you could say, well, I follow that to determine the kind of happiness that my natural or proper function generates or leads me to. So and I'm going to quote here, pardon me, what kind of life, this is B2 in your outline, is the most, quote, noble performance, and this isn't a theatrical performance, right? This is an activity, right? A natural activity to human beings. So if you're doing the thing that's most noble or ennobling, right, is as good as you can be for its own sake. That's the kind of happiness that we're trying to find. So Aristotle puts it here as the function of a good man, and some of the parentheses is just me adding English, is to be good and noble, right? Is to be a good person and noble person, worthy of, the goodness. So the function of a good man is to be good and noble in the performance of noble acts. And if any action is well performed when it's performed with accordance with the appropriate excellence. If this is the case, the human good, you just got to read this a couple times, it's hard, turns out to be the activity of soul, you could say mind, right, in accordance with virtue. So our goodness as a human being, our moral goodness, is something we do as an activity of soul, so essentially us, part of our mental equipment, part of our choice, that accords with the virtues. And if there are more than one virtue, of course, we want the function that we have that accords with more than one. Before we get to the end of the lecture today, if you had a list of virtues and you were saying, well, the most noble or good function of humans is to choose and act according to these virtues, what happens, natural question, I'm anticipating where you might be headed, when some of these virtues conflict, right? If you go up the screen here to honesty and courage and generosity and patience, if you're a person who wants to be characterized, have your character right, described in these ways, maybe sometimes honesty pulls in opposite directions from courage, or maybe generosity pulls in opposite directions from patience. Not denying that. This is complicated. There's no formula the way Mill or Kant adherents might say their theories provide. But maybe it's complicated because being moral is complicated, being life is complicated. and it takes some thought and practice, which is, of course, what Aristotle's going to say. So let me skip to B3 here. You can read 7. You can even pause the lecture here and go read 7 to get a sense of what he means by our natural function, well performed, that is in accord with an excellence, a kind of goodness or greatness in the act itself. So B3, so think of the virtues we started with a few minutes ago. Is there a noble way to enact them? Because this is about activities, performing, or sort of following through with them. Is the happiness achieved, B3 in your outline, a kind of excellence that's intrinsic to the act well done? So I'm going to stop here and give an example, true example, and I think it might help explain the point of what is this excellence that I achieve, or this kind of noble self, nobility that I achieve by performing an act in real life in a way that's consistent with the virtues. So here's my question in B3, actually something that it's a real life example, like I said I was going to do. So when I was young, one of 6 kids, we all play piano. It's just, you take your lessons weekly and you practice. And I really didn't like it. I didn't like the fact that my older siblings were doing it and then I had to do it. Didn't want to lead the example. Maybe I wasn't a noble kid. Lead by example for my younger siblings. My dad, a retired banker, retired now, not then, figured, well, he'd motivate me with money. So he paid me to take lessons. So the lessons were, the piano teacher got paid, and I got paid to go. It sounds weird, but there it was. You might ask, well, you weren't doing it for the right reasons then, right? If there's an internal happiness or an internal good to the practice of piano, it's playing gracefully or playing accurately or playing in a way consistent with the composer's musical notes and message, and certainly playing just because I'm getting paid. Let's just assume as a kid that's the only reason I was taking lessons and playing. I seem to have missed the point, right? If there's a goodness in piano playing, it's in creation of music or in duplicating the feelings of the artist. That's Tolstoy's definition, I think, of art. And if I'm only playing because I'm paid, then I'm missing the inherent goodness and excellence of piano playing. Now I'm going to flip the switch. So, or scenario. What if, as a young person, your parents said, I want you to be courageous and patient and kind and compassionate and honest, but I'm going to pay you to do it, right? And let's suppose collecting a happiness paycheck from your folks or a virtue paycheck every week, you said to them, thank you for paying me for being patient and courageous and kind and compassionate. I look forward to our transaction next week when I'm paid to be that kind of person. My guess is, even if you were happy to get the virtue paycheck every week, you would probably say, well, you're missing the point. The point of being virtuous, even when it's difficult, even when the virtues pull you in different directions, you want to be honest here, but then they can't be courageous there. Seems like the point of the virtuous life is you want to be happy doing the virtuous thing for its own sake, right? You're honest because honesty is good. You're courageous because courageous is important. You're patient because patience is a virtue, right? It's a way of living in the world that ennobles the human choices and spirit and acts. So the virtue paycheck, while it may get you to go through the motions of being a patient and kind, generous person, probably wouldn't teach you in the right way the kind of goodness that is coming with or is part and parcel of or is inherent to the virtuous life. So as we're going along through the Aristotle now and the newly shorter piece later, if you want to think, well, would the virtuous life make me happy? You need to understand the right kind of happiness here. And for Aristotle, the right kind of happiness here is the one intrinsic to the act itself, and not the outcome that made 10 people in your family happy. That's Mill. Or maybe not the Kantian framework, which is you're treating everyone as a rational bearer of life in a dignified way, in a consistent fashion. Maybe the virtues require some inconsistency over time. I don't know. So when you hear the word happiness in Aristotle, and it does come up less in New Leave because it's a short piece for her, what you should be thinking is the virtuous good life not only ennobling, right, making me a more noble or better person, does it create the right kind of happiness for what a good person should want, right? Now I'm going to move to B4. This is I'm going to talk about this kind of intrinsic pleasure, and I realize I'm doing it sort of elliptically. I'm sort of like describing it a little bit here and a little bit there, and then trying to flesh it out. It's complicated, right? The pleasures of a good life shouldn't be reduced to something you can put on a postage stamp or the back of an envelope. So B4, Aristotle argues there is intrinsic pleasure, right? Even when we need some external goods to achieve it. So Aristotle's going to say, sure, I need some money to live, to afford to have a good life. I need friends, right? Family. You can't just be virtuous on an island by yourself. Sort of Robinson Crusoe or Tom Hanks in Castaway, right? Hard to practice the virtues and get the goods internal to the practice. The sort of being honest for honesty's sake, being patient for patience' sake. Hard to do that if you're all by yourself. But Aristotle does want to insist there is an intrinsic pleasure to it. And let me stop here with the virtue paycheck. Whatever the difference is between I'm only being kind and patient and courageous because parents pay me, and I don't do it for the money, I don't do it for the fame, I don't do it for the glory, I don't do it for bragging rights, to write in my diary I'm such a good person, for the self-congratulatory pat in the back. I'm doing it because an honest person should want honesty for its own sake. A generous person should want generosity for its own sake. Whatever that pleasure is that generates a good character, and wanting it for its own sake, and wanting it not necessarily for the outcomes that it produces, although those are good too, that's what the good person wants. And if the good person, ennobling person, the virtuous person, wants these virtues to lead a good life, that's what Aristotle means by an excellence, right? It's a way of characterizing the things you do as practices because you're aiming for that pleasure that comes only with doing the thing for its own sake. So how do we figure this out? This is B5 in Aristotle. My outline. Aristotle argues by learning and training. That's book 1, section 9. And if you think about it, how did any of us learn how to be courageous and compassionate and patient? It wasn't automatic. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe saints do this automatically. Not a saint, I don't know. It takes some practice. And if you think back to when you were a kid, you were probably constantly told, friend fell down, oh, help your friend up off the playground. Or wouldn't it be nice if you helped your friend up off the playground? Or if you played a sport and you had a coach, I'm hoping at some point your coach said, no, we have rules, so we all play fair. And sure, sometimes the ref makes a bad call, and so sometimes someone takes advantage of the rules, but that's not a reason for us to do it. A good player, basketball, volleyball, whatever, follows the rules because that's the way the game is, right? You're supposed to want to play the game fairly so that the team that wins is just a better player or has better players. So if, in fact, that's how you learn these virtues as a young person, by practice and habit, like correcting, sometimes I did too much of the honesty, sometimes I did too little. Oh, now I get it. I get that sort of sweet spot where if I wanted to be honest, I had to do this for its own sake. Then all you got to do is you practice them in ways that get to that intermediate state. So I'm on B6 here now in your outline. So Aristotle is going to argue there are different kinds of virtues. There are moral virtues, which we're concerned about here. There are also intellectual virtues, right? Maybe wisdom being one of them. He's going to argue that you can practice them in ways, make sure I'm still on B6 here. Yep. That show deficiency or excess, and that's book 2, section 2. And think of our list. Is the intermediate or mean state, and this isn't like it's not math per se. Take the being too honest with grandma about a fruitcake, that it's awful, and then not being honest at all, like best thing I ever had. It's not like you average them together in some mathematical sense. The mean state is sort of if you had to have them, on a line, that's just an algebra class, it's the midpoint. That's a metaphor, right? So here's what he asks: is there a midpoint for all of these things? And I think Aristotle and virtuous theorists want to say, yeah, pick any virtue you want. Let's pick one we haven't done yet. Maybe compassion or care. Is there such a thing? I'll go back to B6. As an intermediate state of compassion practiced in the right way for the right reason at the right time. And can we learn how to practice compassion? Maybe it comes naturally to you. You're a saint. I'm envious, but it's another question. is it, if compassion's an intermediate state, is there such a thing as too little and too much? And probably yes, right? I mean, you can probably have so much compassion for somebody, right, that you can't see their faults clearly or why you should be with them or not be with them. Say it's a relationship and the compassion's exercised in the course of a relationship. Is there such a thing as being having too little compassion? Again, probably yes, right? Hard-hearted might be the word, or cold, or fish, or something. So if someone wears their heart on their sleeve, let's say that's too much compassion. They're always feeling compassion for somebody, and somebody else doesn't do it enough. It's by practicing, you get to that sweet spot where you have the right amount of compassion. So here's Aristotle's basic definition. I'm in B7, and my apologies, it's quite long, but we'll go through it once maybe, and then I'll come back and do it bit by bit. So his definition of virtue: it's a state of character. So it's a description of your agency or identity, right? It's a character trait, right? But it's a state, sort of, it's a holistic kind of picture of who you are. The state of character concerned with choice, so you got to pick it, and we'll say more about that in a second. Lying in a mean, that's what we've been trying to get at that midpoint. The mean relative to us, so it's a human feature. Nope, I lost my place. This being determined by a rational principle. You got to reason your way through this, right? This isn't caprice or arbitrary. And by a principle by which the man, woman of practical wisdom could determine it. So it takes, practical wisdom is Aristotle's answer for everyday common sense that you would learn. Now it's a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess, too much, that which depends on defect, not enough. It's a mean because the vices, respectively, and the vices are both too much of the virtue and too little, fall short or exceed what is right in both passion, sort of your emotional, what am I saying, passions? Just say emotions, right? People are motivated by their emotions, and the passions have to be rightly suited to the situation. And actions, you practice the virtues by doing things, while virtue finds and chooses what is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance, what's it made of, and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. The one thing I wanted to say here as we went along, and I said something about choice, well, Aristotle does. You might ask, and thinking back over the list of virtues that characterized your life, your identity, your agency, a couple of questions. One might be something like this. Okay, I'm a virtuous person. I'm courageous, compassionate, honest, patient. I'm all those things. So I now understand what that means, sort of. I'm supposed to practice these virtues, this is Aristotle, at the right time, when called for, in the right place, situated and facing a situation, in the right way, not for money, not for honor or glory or fame or whatever, but for their own sake. You're sort of aiming at that sort of ennobling character, right? He calls it an excellence, right? Okay, so now I know what they are. Don't exactly know how I get there, and this is the choice matter I'm trying to get to. How are the virtues concerned with choice? Well, like anything in morality, if you don't choose to be a good person, you don't choose to practice the virtues, if you don't choose to sort of do them over and over so you can learn them as part of your identity, you might be faulted for it. So, for example, you use the grandma and the fruitcake. I'm going to make a decision to tell her something, right? I mean, here she is in front of me with this awful fruitcake. And knowing my Aristotle, I don't want to do it because someone paid me to be nice to grandma, or because I just want her to love me, and she won't love me if I say nasty things about the fruitcake. I mean, does anyone think that lying or telling the truth just to gain affection is the good reason to do something? But I do have a choice. I have a choice to well, what am I going to say? And I think Aristotle would say, well, look, you're free to just lie outright. This is a wonderful fruitcake. You're free to tell too much truth, right? It's awful, grandma. It tastes like shit, right? It's awful. What we hope here is the choice you make to be a virtuous person and exercise, in this case, honesty in the right way, that intermediate point between excess and deficiency, would be a function of what? Your character, what you've done in the past over and over and over in situations like this and learned about that intermediate state. What practical wisdom, common sense would tell you? Well, too much honesty is going to hurt her feelings. Too little, and I'm skirting my duty to tell the truth, right? I'm supposed to be an honest person. So the choice here assuming you have some external goods, right? You're not so impoverished that you can't have a situation where you even have cake, right? You've learned from friends and jobs and family and school kind of how the world works. The choice you have here is to say, I want to hit that intermediate spot. And if it helps to think of it this way, is not too much honesty, not too little, but enough that I get the internal reward that is honesty for its own sake by answering in the right way at the right time in the right place. So this is a lot to say because Grandma's just asked me and I'm supposed to answer. What do you say? Something like is, thank you very much for the fruitcake. It's so sweet. Does that work? I've had Grandma's fruitcake. My grandma's passed on. God rest her soul. It was sweet in terms of sweet, like it was sugary, but it was awful. It tasted like candy in a cake. So don't hurt her feelings. Don't skirt the truth altogether. Don't tell it completely outright either. Is this the intermediate state? Arguably, yes. I think I've, in the fruitcake example, done the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. I get the reward of being a good person without letting her down and without sort of lying flatly to her face. Difficult, contextual. We're going to need to know a lot about the situation to make the right answer. So I'm going to switch over to the new leap here. She sounds a lot like Aristotle. Maybe this is easier for you to digest. So if you want to do this one first in the reading and then go to the Aristotle, that's fine. So here's her definition. The notion that actions create habits. So you do something over and over and it becomes a habit. And that shapes your character or moral character. That's virtue ethics. And she does say, it's as old as the ancient Greeks. You read the Aristotle. And the underpinning of a lot of Catholic moral theology, fine. You don't have to be Catholic to be virtuous. There are virtue theories in every major religious and philosophical tradition, I would bet. Everyday repeated actions, this is her quote, bringing lunch to a neighbor, stealing from work, if you do it over and over, form us into the sort of people we are. We're generous friends, the embezzler, untrustworthy scumbags, or surfing the web, distracted dilettantes. So in brief, if I want to have a good character and make good choices, how do you do it? You practice them over and over until it becomes sort of second nature. Still have to choose it when the time comes, right? I may have a habit of faithful and decent truth-telling, which I've developed over time by practices that became habits. But I still got to choose, right? When Grandma asks me, I can decide to follow my consistent character and give the answer, which I think I gave before. That was perhaps the intermediate point of honesty. Still got to practice it. Still got to choose it. But maybe it's second nature in the sense that it's so much informed the way I've developed. I become the honest person, right? And I achieve the goods of that, which is honesty for its own sake. So she looks at, I'm at C3, 2, excuse me. She examines 3 virtues, not the ones we probably listed above, that she thinks when we go online, so this is our internet life, could make us better people or worse. If we do worse, if we do them to too much or too little, and at that intermediate state, make us good people, virtuous people. I don't read any Latin, so I'm going to assume I'm saying this right, that curiositas. If you know better, please. I'm happy to have you say it your way. She calls this the vice that killed the cat, a moral problem that was much discussed in the late Greco-Roman period. It's been neglected in recent history. And then she talks about recollection, inwardness, and finally mindfulness. So I'm going to go look at her article, and maybe we'll just do 1 or 2, and you can do 3 on your own, and see if we hear and see Aristotle in the article. Let me see if I can call that up. There it is. Curiosity. And she says, notice right there in the paragraph, it is a positive character trait. Normally when you say someone's curious, you're paying them a compliment, right? Unless you're saying curiosity killed the cat. That's the excess part. Sorry, cat lovers. She defines it as a lively interest in your surroundings and readiness to learn. I think this is Augustine, another famous Catholic theologian and saint prior to Aquinas, called this the lust of the eye, right? I love that word. Nothing to do with sexual desire, right? It refers, if you look at the end of this paragraph, excessive desire for information, and sensory input. Okay. So I imagine, like me, if you're ever online and bored, You might jump from web page to web page, meme to meme, social media account to media account. Is that curiosity? No, that seems like it's too much. I need more information. I need more. I need a picture of Joe Biden. I need a picture of Donald Trump. I'm going to go look at the latest picture of this. That seems to me a kind of curiosity, but it's too much, right? It doesn't dig deep. It doesn't ask for fine distinctions. It doesn't ask for context, right? She even says it here in the next section: losing the ability to control your consumption, getting swallowed up by obscure facts, lacking discrimination. Seems like that's having too much curiosity, right? And you don't really get anything out of it, maybe getting exhausted. Excuse me. Do you learn anything very much? Do you retain any of that information? And so, the medieval period would have been aware of this as books went from hand manuscripts to the Gutenberg printing press. Everyone had a book, and there was a fear of people were going to just be dilettantes, right? On the other hand, and this is what she says is the other extreme, so there's too much curiosity. Too little, this is the Luddites, right? Famously destroyed machines that were putting them out of work. You can't, in our day and age, for practical reasons to get a job, or even for this class because we're online, you can't avoid the internet. I mean, you could take a hiatus, right? I have friends of mine during Lent that give up the internet except for work, right? Or give it up after 5 o'clock. So it's not really helpful to sort of dump it, right? Because there's great stuff about the internet, right? I read the newspaper that way, at least since mid-March of 2020. A lot of us have been going to Zoom happy hours or Zoom concerts, all of that stuff. You don't want to give that up. So there's got to be an intermediate point with curiosity between excessive consumption with no discrimination and abandoning the internet. Whatever that intermediate sweet spot is, that would be the virtue, right? So let's see, we can go to another one. Virtue that is curiosity done in the right way for the right reason, that satisfies itself or seeks the pleasure of information for character building, for knowledge, and not in this sort of excessive efficiency way. So let me go back to the outline, which is the other one I want to do. I don't know if I want to do each of them. Let's see. How about, you want to do recollection or inwardness? How about mindfulness? I like that one. And I'm not a Buddhist, but I can appreciate that. So let me search for mindfulness in the article here. Here we go. Being mindful. Sort of, it's complex, and she says impossible to summarize in a few paragraphs. I know a lot of my friends that do yoga talk about mindfulness, right? Going on in the present moment, being aware of your body, your emotions, sort of taking what do they call this? A sort of status check. Like, how am I feeling right now? Take a deep breath. How does that feel? What are you thinking about? Maybe put that on hold for a couple seconds, right? And she says, here, when you do that, you acquire the discipline of attending to what's going on in you, commanding what is commanding attention at all levels to penetrate what is more deeply into what's present rather than skimming the surface. So is there a value in being mindful, right? And of course, you could be too mindful or not mindful enough. And here's where she's going to take a shot at the internet, right? Where is it? Buddhist recollection. Here we go. The findings of science, I love this, as to the effect of the internet use on the human brain should impel us to dust off these neglected ideas. So are there ways that we use the internet that don't make us mindful? Well, again, probably if you're like me, I take my internet breaks on Facebook to see what my friends are doing or, see what my family's doing. When you escape into the internet, right, getting away from yourself, you're probably not being mindful of what's going on right here, right? So even with mindfulness, you can have it, I can be too focused on myself and where my body's at, so I'm not aware of the world. Or if I'm on the internet chasing down something, not aware at all, right? That's why sometimes I think people on the internet feel disembodied, right? They don't feel like they have, fleshy bits, material substance, and probably makes them, this is speculation for the psychologists out there, you can correct me if I'm wrong, why people find it so much easier to be nasty online in the chat room is they're not mindful of how they feel or having the I-thou person-to-person interaction that comes with looking someone in the eye, right? So any of these things on the internet could be excesses or deficiencies. And what she wants to aim at, I know I've skimmed through this rather quickly, is there's got to be an intermediate state by practiced, which becomes a habit, that leads us to the goods internal to the acts themselves, ennoble us, right? Make us better people. And if we do that on the internet, using it as a tool, sort of finding that virtuous state, that would actually be to sort of humanize this great technological tool. So I know I did this article really quick, but this has some resonance with what I hope you see. Hope I explained with what Aristotle talks about. Let me go back, to the overview. So you probably should be asking, if you haven't read the Aristotle yet, what he means by happiness, and I've given you some passages to look at. What he means by claiming the moral life pursues the goodness, for its own sake, the intrinsic pleasure of doing the right thing. What he means by an excellence, and this is when you achieve that good for its own sake, you've achieved what is ennobling. I know I'm using that word for translation for excellence. Look at his list of virtues. Can you learn them like a craft? Like woodworking or pottery or music? He thinks you can. Those are the analogies that were available to him. And let's see if I promise to do anything else today. I'm going to post, after I post this online, that the next set of grades are done, and I might put in the announcements some hints about the rewrite. To give you a heads up for next time, week 5, excuse me, it should be Mills on Liberty. Yes. So in Mills on Liberty, we get another candidate approach for how to lead the good life or an ethical life. It's not going to be pursuing happiness or consistent rules that treat everybody equally who are in the same situation or leading a virtuous life. Mill's going to argue on Liberty, as long as, and this is the summary, but you can just keep this in your head if you read the Mill, competent, rational adults only harm themselves when they're acting and don't harm non-consenting second parties, third parties. We should allow people the freedom to do the thing they want, provided that, again, they're not harming against their will non-consenting other parties. So that would open up a lot of liberty, a lot of freedom for you to do what you want. Again, if you're an adult, free and rational. So that's the reading for next time. I will post this as soon as I can. And then again, to say, make in the announcement section something about the next paper. And where is... oh, there it is. Sorry. I was opening up a new section. I didn't have to do that. There I am. All right. So I will post this and say something about papers on announcements, and then you can dive into the on Liberty. See you next week.